911, what is your emergency?
This was a horrific murder.
I just opened up the door, or walked in the door, and she's dead on the floor.
A doctor was killed.
It was very passionate, very intentional.
There's a hammer at the side, and she's bashed in the back of the head.
She walked into her normal kitchen, and then this horrific, brutal crime happened.
There's blood everywhere.
People were afraid, people were worried.
Everybody lost. Who would do this to her? We have to find a way to explain this.
She was concerned she didn't have sex as much as I wanted.
We went from 0 to 60 in about 2 seconds.
Everybody calls him Hammer.
Something doesn't seem right about this.
I just looked and I thought, my God, somebody killed her.
A successful doctor and mother of two, highly regarded in her Southwest Florida community, is found bludgeoned to death in her own home. After weeks of investigating, new witnesses and key information helped detectives begin to rapidly connect the dots and to start taking a closer look at several potential suspects.
Now the investigation has gone from almost treading water to new breath, and we went from 0 to 60 in about 2 seconds.
Although Teresa Seaver's husband Mark was out of town at the time of her murder, his digital footprints grabbed the attention of detectives.
Some more suspicion kind of fell upon Mr. Seavers after he voluntarily allowed them to dump his phone. And that's when the first batch of messages for the beginning of May and the end of April between him and Mr. Wright were discovered.
The discovery of burner phones is the next big step in the investigation.
The burner phones were absolutely critical in this case. Mark Seaver's burner phone pings its first ping May 7th and pings its last ping on May 26th at 1:34 p.m. And Curtis Wainwright's burner phone pings its first ping on May 17th and pings its last ping on June 29th.
These two men were using their personal cell phones to cue each other to get on their burner phones.
You see things like, hey, text other because the other two of us aren't likely to carry both at the same time. And in my experience, that screams burner phone or prepaid phone.
When they dumped the tower next to Mr. Wright's home and dumped the tower next to the Seavers home, there was a common number on both of those towers. And that number was Mr. Wright's burner phone.
With cell phone evidence in hand and the cooperation of Rogers' girlfriend, Curtis Wainwright and Jimmy the Hammer Rogers are arrested in Missouri in connection with Dr. Teresa Seaver's death. The arrests come 2 months after the horrific murder. By February 2016, both men would find themselves headed back to Florida. But this time, there are no trips to Walmart or the beach. They are booked into a Lee County, Florida jail. According to Wright's account, he and Rogers carried out a brutal attack on Dr. Seavers, bludgeoning her to death. With the pressure on and the evidence growing, Curtis Wainwright points the finger at his childhood best friend, Mark Seavers, as the mastermind behind his wife's murder.
Curtis Wainwright's testimony was crucial because it connects all the dots.
The biggest point in his testimony was explaining how the murder happened.
They go and they basically do a little stakeout of the Sievers house. They go in for a few minutes because while Curtis Wainwright has been there before, Jimmy Rogers has not, so that he can see the house and get a sense of it. And in fact, I think it is at that point, Curtis Wainwright, when he's testifying, talks about how Jimmy Rogers picks up a hammer as they're walking in the door and says, "the hammer of destiny," when talking about Teresa Sievers. They then spend the day going to a Walmart, going to the beach, and they return that night. When Teresa Sievers lands at the airport and then drives to her house, they are at the home and they surprise her as she walks in. As soon as they've committed this horrendous crime, they go back out of the house, they take off the protective garments they've put on so that they leave no trace, and they start driving back.
As Curtis Wainwright lays out his version of the murder-for-hire plot, law enforcement began to close the loop around Mark Sievers.
When we started looking at this case, we looked at everybody as possible suspects. But within the first couple days, we had our second interview with Mark Sievers, which was on July 1st.
Talking about your relationship, have you guys been contemplating any kind of separation or divorce? Has there been any marital problems?
No.
About 6 months ago.
There were parts of the interview, of the recording, where he was alone. We think he may have known he was being recorded, but his behavior, I'll say his behavior was different.
God, Teresa, what could I have done? If I was with you, this wouldn't happen. If I came back, this wouldn't happen.
He did a couple different things that seemed completely fake. He would try and act like he was sobbing, almost to the point of where he couldn't breathe. But it didn't seem like an authentic physical reaction. It seemed completely fake. He would act like he was crying, but he was never congested. He never actually had tears.
There's no right prescribed way to act after your spouse has been brutally murdered, after you're not allowed to go back into your home with your children. There's no playbook for that.
He gave the impression that he wanted to help, but when you really asked him the questions that you needed him to answer, he didn't really want to answer them. He'd beat around the bush. His body language and his actions were borderline dramatic. You know, it didn't seem sincere.
I'm not using this as an excuse. No, I'm not using what happened as an excuse. I typically wouldn't remember the details of that.
Something doesn't seem right about this.
The silence between Mark Sievers and buddy Curtis Wainwright following Teresa's murder spoke louder than words.
You would think that a relationship between two men where they discuss everything and they're best friends, that if one had his wife murdered, he would certainly call his best friend to come to his aid or to talk to him about the murder of his wife. And that didn't happen. And then after the murder of Teresa, this incredible activity of texting and calling each other back and forth all the time, a lifetime friendship, went virtually silent.
So Mark obviously had this set up from the beginning as an alibi, because he can justifiably say, well, it wasn't me, I'm sitting here with Teresa's family. He knows she's been murdered, but you got to pad the alibi. You know, the work calls and says Teresa doesn't show up. So now he's looking at her phone. He's trying to call her phone and do, you know, iPhone locate and all this other stuff, and it shows her at the house. So he's thinking, you know, a normal person would be like, all right, well, she flew in late, maybe she's sleeping or something like that. It was a long weekend. Your mother's been checking on the house the entire time. Bonnie's been checking on the house the entire time. If you need somebody to readily go check on your wife who lives in the area, wouldn't it make sense to have Bonnie go check on her? No, that's not what happens. He calls Mark Petritis, who's a family friend, and says, hey, can you go check on my wife for me?
With the cooperation of suspect Curtis Wainwright, forensic evidence stretching from Missouri to Florida, cell phone records, and burner phones, an arrest warrant is issued for Mark Sievers in the murder of his wife, Dr. Teresa Sievers. And shocking sexually explicit text messages from Mark Sievers' phone begin to come to light.
When you actually get into their phone, it's almost like a whole other life.